70,000 years ago, there was no such thing as race. Every human being had roughly the same skin tone, stood at roughly the same height, and looked broadly alike. Now, take a look at us. We're the same species, yet two people can stand 1.5 feet apart in height. We're the same species, yet some of us run and jump in places where barely half the oxygen exists. We're the same species, yet one person walks through an epidemic untouched while another drops dead. In a mere 70,000 years, what on earth happened? Come back with me to somewhere in Africa 70 millennia ago. A band of humans stands gazing north. These are people who have never once set foot outside this continent. And if you crack open their DNA, you find something that stops you cold. The genetic variation inside that single band was greater than the variation across all of humanity today. Put another way, the genetic gap between a Korean and a Brazilian in our time is smaller than the gap that existed within one African village back then. Every seed of human diversity was already tucked away there, in Africa, before anyone took a single step. And some of them started to move. Some crossed deserts, some walked east along the coastline, some climbed over mountain ranges. It was an agonizingly slow trickle spread across thousands of years, with no intention of ever coming back. They had no idea what lay ahead. They simply walked in the direction where food was. Up to that point, their bodies were still nearly identical to the day they left Africa. But at every place they arrived, a completely different world was waiting. A savanna that blows past 100 degrees, a jungle where you can't see the sky, a plateau with half the oxygen, a land of ice where the sun doesn't rise for half the year. And that's when the earth began to carve those bodies. The first things to change were the ones you can see with your own eyes. Picture the Kenyan savanna, 104 degrees at midday, a plain almost bare of trees. The Maasai, who've lived there for millennia, often stand over 6 feet, and it's no rarity to meet someone pushing 6'3". Their arms and legs are long and lean. Why did they end up this way? With no air conditioning around, the body became one. When you're tall with long limbs, your skin surface is larger and heat escapes faster, like a radiator engineered for the maximum possible surface area. Only the ones who could hold on without collapsing from heat stroke survived, and across thousands of generations that body plan got sculpted into shape. It's the same logic behind why the desert fox has enormous ears and the Arctic fox has tiny ones. Humans were no exception. And yet, within that very same Africa, there are people built in the exact opposite direction. Drop down into the Congo rainforest, where the trees grow so dense the sky disappears. The Mbuti, who've lived in that forest for tens of thousands of years, average around 4'9", the height of a 6th grader. Picture someone 6'3" trying to hunt in there, snagged on vines, cracking into branches, and at the first rustle of a twig, the prey is already gone. The forest sides with the small. A short, compact body slips between the trees like water. On top of that, rainforest humidity climbs past 90%, and at that level, sweat barely evaporates at all. On the savanna, being tall helped shed heat. Here it means nothing, and a smaller body actually generates less heat and holds up better. The same Africa with survival pushing in opposite directions. People we lump together under the single word African, separated by a 4-hour flight, molded toward opposite extremes. But this is only the difference you can see. What truly raises the hair on your arms was happening where the eye can't reach. At 13,000 feet, only about 60% of the oxygen you'd find at sea level remains. An ordinary person who climbs up there gets a pounding headache, dizziness, and in severe cases the lungs fill with fluid and they die. And yet there are peoples who've lived at that altitude for thousands of years, the Tibetans in the Himalayas and the Aymara in the Andes. Here's where it gets remarkable, because the two of them solved the exact same problem with completely different answers. The Andean peoples went straight at it. They enlarged the engine. Their lungs run more than 30% bigger than a lowlander's, the chest barreled out like a drum, and on top of that, they cranked up the concentration of the oxygen-carrying substance in the blood so as not to waste a single molecule. In engine terms, they bumped up the displacement and tuned the fuel efficiency at the same time. The catch is that this strategy comes at a cost. When there's too much oxygen carrier, the blood turns thick and vessels can clog. A problem that genuinely afflicts a lot of people in the high Andes. The Tibetans took an entirely different road. Their blood is nearly the same as someone living at sea level, and their lungs aren't as large as the Andeans. Instead, they breathe more often and more deeply. The sheer volume of air they pull in runs 50% higher than the Andeans. Rather than thickening the blood, they rewired the breathing itself. And the source of that ability is genuinely staggering. When the Tibetan genome was analyzed in 2014, researchers found a highly unusual version of the gene that governs high-altitude adaptation, a variant that exists nowhere else in modern humans. It's been found in exactly one other place. The Denisovans, those cousins of our species who went extinct tens of thousands of years ago. The ancestors of the Tibetans crossed with that vanished species, had children, and their descendants happened to inherit the gene that fit high-altitude life perfectly. A gene borrowed from a dead species ended up saving lives. The Andeans remodeled their own bodies. The Tibetans inherited a legacy from a species that no longer exists. Faced with the identical problem of thin air, they arrived at opposite answers on opposite sides of the planet. Few examples show as clearly that evolution has no single correct answer. So far, we've been talking about extreme environments, 13,000-foot plateaus and 100-degree savannas. But do these differences only show up in extreme places? Not even close. They're running in your kitchen and at your next dinner with friends too. Let's talk about milk. Until about 10,000 years ago, no adult human on Earth could digest it. None of them, without exception. Mammals are wired that way. Once weaning ends, the ability to break down milk switches off, because the body figures it no longer needs it and flips that switch down. Even we, who drank milk just fine as babies, don't handle it as easily now. The body decided long ago, that's enough, move on to something else. Then, around 7,500 years ago, somewhere in Eastern Europe, someone different was born. A person whose switch never turned off, able to digest milk their whole life. Under normal circumstances, that mutation would have meant nothing, a mildly odd trait and little more. But it happened that right at that moment, something was underway that would change history. People had started raising cattle and sheep. To them, milk was a miracle food, because it let you pull calories every single day without killing the animal. When the grain ran out in winter or the hunt came up empty, a cow alone was enough to make it to tomorrow. The person who could digest milk survived the winter, had more children, and those children inherited the same ability. In a mere 300 generations, 7,500 years, 90% of Northern Europeans came to tolerate milk. The truly astonishing part is that the same thing happened independently in Africa. The Maasai and the Fulani developed that ability on their own, through a different genetic mutation from the European one, but with an identical outcome, and both are cattle-herding peoples. So if you drink milk and your stomach turns, your body isn't broken. It's proof that your ancestors didn't keep cattle. Alcohol tells a similar story. You almost certainly know someone who turns tomato red off a single beer. Seen on a global scale, that's a pretty peculiar phenomenon. When we drink, the body produces a toxin, and the ability to clear that toxin quickly is weakened in nearly half of East Asians, while among Europeans and Africans it's all but non-existent. Why only there? Around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, rice farming intensified in southern China. Flooding the paddies fouled the water, and instead of clean water, people drank a fermented rice beverage, alcohol, which, by killing bacteria, was safer than the water itself. But the heavy drinkers tended to turn violent, cause accidents, and die young, while the ones who flushed red after a single cup drank in moderation and stopped in time. That way, they slaked their thirst without touching the polluted water and naturally sidestepped over-drinking. Across hundreds of generations, that gene spread through East Asia. So a low tolerance for alcohol isn't a weakness. It's an anti-binge device your ancestors installed a couple of millennia ago, the body hitting the brakes on its own before things go too far. Milk and alcohol, in the end, tell the same story. What your ancestors ate and drank is still running in your body today. The kitchen of thousands of years ago carries on, unbroken, into yours. But there was one event that split human beings apart in a far more brutal way than this slow carving by the environment. In 1347, a black shadow rolled in from the east of Europe. In a mere 7 years, half the population of the continent vanished. In some villages, not a soul was left alive. There was no one to clear the bodies, so they rotted inside the houses, and flocks wandered the fields with no owner. The blacksmith died, the baker died, the priest died. With no one left to hold funerals, people dug pits and poured the corpses in. It was the quietest 7 years in Europe's history. And here an uncomfortable question surfaces. If they lived in the same village, drank the same water, bought bread at the same market, and prayed in the same church, why did half die and half live? It wasn't luck. On the surface of our immune cells, there's a kind of door, and the pathogen knocks on that door to slip inside the cell. In most people, that door stood wide open, so the disease got in and it killed them. But some people had a defective door thanks to a mutation missing 32 letters in the genetic code. With those letters gone, the door never got built properly, and if the door won't open, the pathogen can pound on it all it likes and still can't get through. The people carrying that defect survived, had children, and those children inherited the same flaw. Notice the detail here. Before the plague, that mutation meant absolutely nothing. It was just a slightly different strand of DNA. The plague changed everything, and a defect that had been useless suddenly became the key to survival. In just 7 years, the genetic map of Europe was redrawn, and today around 10% of Europeans carry that mutation. Geneticists have long suspected that epidemics like this one are what spread it, though the debate is still open. And here comes a coincidence that raises goosebumps. 600 years later, in the 1980s, the virus that causes AIDS appears. When researchers studied the route that virus uses to break into immune cells, it turned out to be the exact same door. And the people whose door is broken, the descendants of the plague survivors, resist that virus almost perfectly. A gene that the 14th century plague had filtered was holding back AIDS in the 21st. In fact, the handful of patients ever declared cured of AIDS all received a bone marrow transplant from donors carrying that mutation. A broken door became the key to a cure. Unlike the environment, which carved bodies bit by bit over millennia, death rewrote the genetic map in a matter of years. It's nothing like the pace at which the savanna's heat stretched height across thousands of generations. It was the cruelest sculptor of them all, and also the fastest. Through all of this, the Earth never stopped carving the human body. The heat of the savanna lengthened the limbs, the damp of the jungle shrank them. The thin air of the plateau remade the lungs and the blood, hurting remodeled the gut. The fouled water of the rice paddies built a break in front of the wine cup, and epidemics smashed the doors of the immune system. The sum of all that is what we now call race. It isn't only skin color, from the bones to the lungs, the blood, the stomach, the immune system. What the Earth sculpted wasn't a single surface layer, but the entire body. And here comes the twist that really gets under your skin. Do you know how much the genes of these seemingly so different humans actually differ? By 1/10%. The genetic gap between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane is wider than the gap between a Maasai and an Mbuti. For 70,000 years, the Earth carved with everything it had, and in the end, only 1,000th of us changed. The other 99.9% is still identical to those people who set out from Africa 70 millennia ago. Whether you stand 6'3" or 4'9", whether you digest milk or not, whether your face flushes red with wine or stays pale, all those differences added together barely reach that 1,000th. Maybe race isn't a classification at all, but something closer to the notes the Earth left written on the human body. It was 104 degrees here. There was only half the oxygen here. An epidemic carried off half of them here. There was no clean water here. For 70,000 years, every environment on the planet engraved a line into our bodies, and we, unable to read it, simply assumed we were different. We aren't born different. It's the same body, sculpted in different ways by the Earth. The savanna's way, the plateau's way, the rice paddy's way. The direction of the chisel changed, but the material was the same from beginning to end. And this carving isn't finished. At this very moment, the environment is still shaping our bodies. If, tens of thousands of years from now, humanity looks back at our era, they'll be able to read from our descendants' bodies what kind of world we lived in, exactly as we read our ancestors' bodies today. Because it's written in yours too. The milk that upsets your stomach, the face that reddens over a glass, all of it is the fingerprint of someone who survived thousands of years ago. Being here means you're the descendant of someone who made it through every one of those environments. Your body is a letter your ancestors sent you, a letter 70,000 years long, and we've only just read the first page. Tell me in the comments what you make of all this. Which line do you think the Earth left written in your own body? And if you like looking at history and evolution from this angle, subscribe to the channel.